Thank you very much, Mr. Kerner, for this very kind introduction. I have indeed thought about the message I would like to give you to take home today to the many of you who are here today from the different sectors you come from. I also have to say that I am overwhelmed by this audience. As scientists, when you're talking to a large audience, it's 200 people, but 3,000 people, that is really impressive. Thank you very much for coming. I wondered how the society, how you handle violence and radicalism and how they can be prevented, because that is the topic and also the main question of your Congress. As practitioners, as politicians, you have specific experience with this topic, and you may wonder what a historian can contribute to this subject. What I can promise you is that I will de-dramatize this topic. As witnesses or as people who are directly involved with things, we tend to find our own experiences highly dramatic and unique, completely new, and therefore overwhelming. However, historians, and that is what they have been trained to do, they have a quite wide perspective on the past. Looking back at things can help to better understand our present and to situate it in the continuum of time. Historians can help find older lines of traditions and revive experiences of the past and bring them back into our memory, a memory that is becoming more and more a short-time memory in our time. With reviving past experiences, the new and the unique of the present is identified, and it is also put in place. The dramatic and scandalous elements are lost in this process, and I think that is beneficial because in times of scandals and drama, it's very difficult to make good politics. Violence and radicalism, those are two terms that make us afraid and that are not part of our civilized world, a world in which we try to teach children in the families and in the schools to have respect for one another and to also practice this respect. And above all, not to solve their conflicts using violence. Nevertheless, and we should not forget that, this learning process of civilization is a long process, and it's very slow for each and every individual, as well as for the society as a whole. From a historical point of view and over the length of time, we have come a long way in this respect. Violent crimes such as murder or grievous bodily harm is going down according to criminal statistics. Some of the things that were allowed in the past are now no longer so. For example, violence in marriage or sexual abuse. Of course, there is a large number of cases that are not reported, but this number has also been high in the late 19th century when the state and the representatives of the state started collecting numbers of reported crimes and analyzing these figures. Also violence that has not been reported, for example, violence among male youth and young men. This violence has not increased in our region. Of course, there are sometimes little quarrels on the schoolyard or on the way home. Of course that happens, but it also happened 100 or 200 years ago. More so because back then adults were role models, and up until the 1970s, physical violence was used in the classroom. From my time in school, I remember a teacher, and I still even remember his name, who was a primary school teacher, And when he was in charge of the schoolyard, he would bang people's heads together when they started quarreling, and I've never been able to forget this sound. Also, church festivals in the 19th century were festivals where men would just start beating each other up because they had drunk too much. Violence was a means of penalizing and disciplining others up until the 20th century. And it was with a great effort that in the middle of the 19th century, the public practice of striking someone as a penalty was abolished. But in the private areas, in schools and families and in the military, violence continued. And that is also part of violence, legitimized violence exercised by the state or authority figures against their subjects. In the First World War, soldiers complained about the harsh punishments that their officers used to punish smaller offenses. On public pressure, these punishments were abolished officially, but in an unofficial setting, military can still be quite a violent setting. There are two things I would like to illustrate with that. On the one hand, violence is not only the kick against the shin that a young man administers to a young woman in a Berlin subway station, as it happened very recently. And this young woman, as a consequence of this kick, fell down the stairs. But violence also happens where institutions exercise discipline and obedience with the help of physical violence. Secondly, both forms of violence, the institutionalized violence and social violence, have a long tradition. They have not only emerged in the 21st century. Nevertheless, things have changed in the past decades. On the one hand, it was possible to create public institutions that are more or less violence-free, and that was not easy. Witnesses of the time criticized and published petitions and complained against violence in public institutions. The German legislator waited until the year 2000 to enshrine the right of nonviolent education for every child in law. On the other hand, sensitivity in the public space has changed. In the first panel, we heard a lot from all participants about the mission and the responsibility of civil society. What was common practice in the 19th century today is forbidden. It used to be the parents. It was the parents who spoke up to teachers who used violence in the classroom, but only in the late 1960s. A central motive was defense against humiliation. Of course, humiliation does not necessarily come in the form of physical violence. You can humiliate someone by looking at them in a certain way, or you can humiliate someone verbally with your gestures, or with abstaining from making such gestures. For example, if someone greets me and I consciously decide not to return the welcome. On the contrary, violence is always humiliating. It makes it clear to the victim that the perpetrator has no respect for the victim and that they are kicking the victim down into the dust, making sure they fall to the ground. Humiliation has become a problem that the society is aware as society democratized. And we accepted the principle of equality. Therefore, it is not a coincidence that public sensitivity and public awareness for humiliation has increased as we learned how to exercise democracy. The late 60s and 70s were a watershed in this process. The broad attack against authorities, be them professors, teachers, police officers, judges, this attack was linked to the claim of no longer being brought down by such authorities. You can almost take that literally. But violence and the potential for humiliation among equals have not been structurally removed by this attack. The reports about mobbing among pupils or work colleagues speak volumes. On the other hand, and that is not a new phenomenon, what is new is our outrage about such behavior, our awareness with which we now react to this. What is also new is the frequency with which we perceive such events. The media covers a lot of this, but even more active are the social media, where such mobbing also takes place in many cases, and which inform us about bullying. There are websites where you can watch so-called happy slappings, and others post videos about gang rapes as a positive thing. We tend to perceive this as a brutalizing of our society, a new quality and quantity of violence which some members of our society exert against others. Sometimes the violence is undirected, it is not caused by anything specific, and hits its object by chance, so it is not strategic or oriented towards power. But in many more cases, the violence that is exercised, be it physical or verbal, is directed against particular victims, which are in most cases weaker: homeless persons, immigrants, and above all, women. If you look at the hate mails that exposed women such as Claudia Roth or Dunja Hayali, and I hope that Ms. Giffey doesn't have to deal with that, mail received by these women is scary in the face of the directed aggressiveness against these women. And most of these hate mails are written by men, and they target the gender of the person that is attacked. That is new. How this male hatred can be countered and how the resentment, the rage, the insecurity, the fear of losing status and the frustration can not only be explained, but also treated in a therapeutical way, is probably also an important topic for a big congress about prevention. One more word about radicalism. Being radical is not something bad. Particularly in science and in research, it is something good, because radical means tackling something by its roots, really looking behind an issue. But it also means not to accept compromises. Those who act radically are not pursuing mutual understanding, but rather want to reinforce their own positions at whatever cost. A radical moralist, and almost all radicals are moralists, a radical moralist does not accept any other opinion. They do not negotiate about their understanding of morale. Talking with radicals is difficult because they won't listen. Or if they pretend to be listening, they still won't be moved even a nanomillimeter from their position. In Germany, we have a lot of experience with radicalism. In the late 1920s and early 30s, the political radicalization took place in two camps, communists on the one hand and nationalists and national socialists on the other hand. This radicalism caused a spiral of violence between the two camps. Back then, there were even quarrels in the parliament, and fortunately, we are miles away from this now. Also, the so-called politics of the street is much more civil than it used to be when paramilitary associations beat each other up and political assassinations were almost a daily phenomenon. Nevertheless, I don't want to diminish the new radicalism that we can see and the new radicalization. If it were to merge into a major movement, it would be a danger for our democracy, because democracy is characterized by the fact that contradictory political interests struggle in a non-violent manner. That struggle hardly ever leads to one side winning and the other side giving in completely. Usually there's a compromise. And this term is a central element of democracy, a compromise that somehow works for both sides, even though both sides would have ideally wanted something else. But neglecting compromise, denying compromise under the auspice or under the excuse of radicalism is, in the end of democratic discussion. This is where the center of society comes in. In the 1930s, National Socialism managed to conquer the center of society, particularly in the face of the very favorable economic situation and a 70 years tradition in democracy. It should be easier nowadays to use these means, to use these instruments democratically. That doesn't mean ignoring radical extremists, but it means driving a gap between these extremes and those citizens who vote for these extremists out of protest. These citizens should find a place in the broad democratic base, and we have to struggle with them to find a compromise. And that is also part of prevention in the sense of the definition given by Mr. Mark as fire protection.